Look at this clay tablet. It's small, fits in your hand, covered with cuneiform wedges pressed into the soft clay 3,200 years ago. It's a letter, actually. An urgent message from the king of Alashia to the king of Ugarit, a coastal city in what's now Syria. The tablet was found in a kiln, half-baked, never finished. The person firing it had to stop mid-process because something terrible was happening. The city was burning. Within hours, maybe days, Ugarit was destroyed. Every building reduced to rubble, the population killed or scattered. And here's the thing, this letter, this desperate unfinished message, dates to around 1177 BCE. And in that same span of years, give or take a few decades, nearly every major civilization in the Mediterranean world and Near East collapsed. Not declined, not gradually faded, collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, who built the palaces at Mycenae and Pylos, gone. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, vanished so completely that we forgot they'd ever existed until archaeologists rediscovered them in the 1800s. Oh, the Egyptian New Kingdom, weakened to the point where it never fully recovered its power. Cyprus, devastated. The coastal cities of Syria and Palestine burned. Within 50 years, the entire interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age simply ended. And here's where it gets truly mysterious. They didn't fall to a single conqueror sweeping across the map. They just ended, almost simultaneously, like a light going out across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Now, if you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where are you right now and what time is it. I love checking the comments. It's like Tokyo at dawn, Toronto at midnight, all happening at once. Tonight, we're going into one of history's genuine mysteries. Not a conspiracy theory or internet speculation, but a real archaeological puzzle that scholars have been trying to solve for decades. Why did all these empires collapse at the same time? What connected their falls? And what does it tell us about our own interconnected world? This is a story about complexity and fragility, about how the same networks that make civilization strong can make them vulnerable. It's a story that starts 3,400 years ago, in a world that was far more sophisticated than you might imagine. Before we can understand why the Bronze Age world collapsed, you need to see what it looked like before the fall. Because here's what most people don't realize. 3,400 years ago, the Mediterranean and Near East weren't a scattered collection of isolated kingdoms. They were the world's first truly globalized economy, an interconnected web of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that would have felt strangely familiar to anyone living in our modern world. Imagine you're standing in the throne room at Mycenae, sometime around 1300 BCE. The walls are massive, built from limestone blocks so large that later Greeks would call them cyclopean, believing only giants could have moved them. The floors are painted plaster, geometric patterns in red and blue and yellow. Light filters through high windows, illuminating frescoes of bull leaping and processions of gift-bearers. The air smells of olive oil burning in bronze lamps, of cedar wood furniture, of the sea salt that pervades everything this close to the coast. And on a table before the king, gifts from across the known world. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, deep blue shot through with golden pyrite. Elephant ivory from Africa, carved into ornate boxes and game boards. Amber from the Baltic, translucent golden beads that have travelled thousands of miles by ship and cart and caravan. Copper ingots from Cyprus, each one stamped with the mark of the smelter who made it. Tin from somewhere far to the north or east. Nobody here is entirely sure where, but without it you can't make bronze, and bronze is everything. Weapons, tools, vessels, the very foundation of civilization's name in this era. This was the Late Bronze Age at its height. Not one empire, but a system of interconnected powers who understood themselves as equals, as members of an exclusive club of great kings. The major players each controlled their own sphere of influence. Egypt dominated the Nile Valley and extended its power into Nubia to the south, and the Levantine coast to the northeast. The Hittites, ruling from their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia, controlled much of what's now Turkey and extended their influence down into Syria. The Mycenaeans, spread across mainland Greece and the islands, weren't a unified empire but a collection of palace kingdoms that shared culture, language, and economic systems. The Assyrians and Babylonians competed for dominance in Mesopotamia. The Mitanni carved out a kingdom in northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia. And dozens of smaller states, city kingdoms really, thrived in the spaces between these great powers: Cyprus with its copper mines, the coastal Levantine cities like Ugarit, Tyre, Sidon, the island of Crete, the coastal settlements of Anatolia. What made this system remarkable was how they interacted. These weren't isolated kingdoms occasionally bumping into each other at their borders. They were engaged in constant, sophisticated diplomacy. We know this because of one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. At Amarna in Egypt, archaeologists found an archive of clay tablets. Letters, diplomatic correspondence between the pharaohs and other kings. And what these letters reveal is a world that would feel strangely modern. The great kings addressed each other as brother, not literally usually, though royal marriages did create actual family bonds, but brother as in equal, as in member of the same exclusive club of legitimate rulers. They exchanged gifts on a massive scale: gold, silver, precious objects, horses, even princesses sent as brides to cement alliances. They negotiated trade agreements, argued about exchange rates, complained when gifts didn't meet expectations. One letter from the Babylonian king to the pharaoh essentially says, "The gold statues you sent last time were gold-plated, not solid gold. This is embarrassing. My messengers looked like fools when we melted them down and found out. Send better gifts next time." These letters show a world of protocol and precedent, of established diplomatic forms. When a king died, his successor would send letters to all the other great kings announcing his accession, reassuring them that existing treaties would be honoured. When a king was ill, other kings would send get-well wishes and sometimes even physicians. When natural disasters struck, aid would flow across borders. This wasn't altruism. This was enlightened self-interest. These kingdoms needed each other. And they needed each other because the entire system depended on trade. Not luxury trade, though there was plenty of that. Fundamental trade in the raw materials that made Bronze Age civilization possible. Bronze, the alloy that gave this era its name, requires copper and tin mixed in roughly 9:1 proportions. Copper was relatively common. You could get it from Cyprus, from Sardinia, from mines in the Sinai, from sources in Anatolia. But tin was rare. The major sources seem to have been somewhere in Central Asia, possibly Afghanistan, possibly the Taurus Mountains, possibly both. Nobody in the Bronze Age Mediterranean produced enough tin locally. It had to be imported across vast distances. This created a vulnerability that nobody quite understood at the time. If the tin supply was disrupted, you couldn't make bronze. If you couldn't make bronze, you couldn't make tools or weapons. Your entire economy would start to fail. But the tin kept flowing, so why worry? The same was true for other essential goods. Egyptian pharaohs needed cedar wood from Lebanon because Egypt had almost no trees suitable for construction. The Mycenaean palaces needed grain from the Black Sea region, and Egypt because their local agriculture couldn't always feed their populations. Everyone wanted copper from Cyprus. Everyone needed luxury goods, both for their own use and as gifts to maintain diplomatic relationships. To understand just how interconnected this world was, you need to know about a shipwreck. In 1982, a sponge diver working off the southern coast of Turkey, near a place called Uluburun, found a weird formation on the seabed. It turned out to be the oldest shipwreck that's been extensively excavated. A merchant vessel that sank around 1400 BCE, about a century before the collapse we're building toward. And what was in this ship tells you everything about Bronze Age globalization. The cargo was staggering in its diversity. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin ingots, origin, uncertain, possibly from Central Asia, possibly from Europe, glass ingots from the Levant, terebinth resin from the pistachio tree used in perfumes and incense, ebony from Africa, ivory, both elephant and hippopotamus, ostrich eggshells, murex shells for making purple dye, pottery from Cyprus, from Canaan, from Mycenaean Greece, a folding wooden writing tablet, the kind used for business correspondence, jewellery, weapons, scarabs, cylinder seals, objects from at least 7 different cultures, representing trade networks that stretched from Mesopotamia to Egypt to the Aegean to Central Asia. This was just one ship. There were hundreds of ships like this crisscrossing the Mediterranean at any given time, merchant vessels carrying goods from port to port, creating economic links that bound the entire region together. Some ships belonged to individual merchants, some were royal trading expeditions, some were probably a mix with merchants hitching cargo onto official ships in exchange for fees or bribes. The system was complex, multi-layered, And it worked. Goods flowed, wealth accumulated, cities grew, and it wasn't just goods that travelled. Ideas moved along these trade routes too. The Mycenaean Greeks borrowed artistic motifs from the Minoans of Crete and from Egypt. The Hittites adopted cuneiform writing from Mesopotamia. Technologies spread, shipbuilding techniques, metalworking innovations, agricultural practices, medical knowledge. When a new way of doing something emerged in one corner of this world, it would ripple outward through the trading networks until everyone who could benefit from it had access. The palace economies kept meticulous records. At Pylos, at Knossos, at other Mycenaean sites, archaeologists have found thousands of tablets written in Linear B, an early form of Greek. These tablets are mostly administrative records, inventories of goods stored in palace warehouses, lists of workers assigned to various tasks, records of religious offerings, textile production quotas. They paint a picture of highly organized, centrally controlled economies where the palace collected taxes in kind, stored surplus goods, and redistributed them to workers and officials. It was bureaucratic, regulated, sophisticated. The same was true at Hattusa, the Hittite capital. Archives there reveal a government that kept track of everything. Treaties with vassal states, records of tribute owed and received, correspondence with other great kings, instructions to provincial governors, legal judgments, religious calendars. The Hittites even had what we might recognize as international law. The treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II, signed after the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, is sometimes called the first recorded peace treaty. It established borders, mutual defense agreements, and even extradition procedures for refugees fleeing from one kingdom to the other. Copies were kept in both kingdoms' archives. This was diplomacy at a level that wouldn't have seemed out of place in early modern Europe. So when you picture the late Bronze Age, don't imagine primitive villages and simple farmers. Picture cities with populations in the tens of thousands, palaces with hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, sophisticated plumbing and drainage, workshops producing specialized goods, artisans who did nothing but make pottery or weave textiles or work metal, scribes who spent years learning complex writing systems so they could keep the administrative records that made the whole system function, merchants who could calculate exchange rates and profit margins, who understood risk and investment, diplomats who conducted negotiations across language barriers, who knew the protocols and precedents that governed international relations. Picture harbours full of ships, the smell of salt water and fish, and the resin used to seal hulls. Warehouses stacked with amphoras full of wine and oil. Dock workers loading and unloading cargo under the supervision of palace officials, who checked everything against lists, making sure the expected goods arrived, that taxes were paid, that nothing was stolen, the sounds of different languages mixing together. Akkadian, the lingua franca of diplomacy, Egyptian, Hittite, Luwian, Mycenaean Greek, the various Semitic languages of the Levantine coast, interpreters earning their keep by facilitating conversations between merchants who came from opposite ends of the known world. This was a cosmopolitan civilization. People travelled. Not just merchants and diplomats, but craftsmen seeking work, mercenaries offering their services, refugees fleeing drought or conflict, adventurers looking for opportunities. A skilled scribe could find employment anywhere writing systems were used. A talented metalworker could work in Egypt or Greece or Anatolia, his skills valued wherever bronze was made. The boundaries between kingdoms were real, certainly. You couldn't just wander across a border without permission, but for those with the right connections or the right skills, the whole world was accessible, and here's what makes this world so remarkable, so worth understanding before we watch it fall. They knew they were connected. The great kings understood that their power depended on maintaining relationships with other great kings. The merchants understood that their profit depended on safe trade routes and stable kingdoms. The palace administrators understood that their cities needed imports to survive. Nobody could go it alone. Nobody wanted to. The system worked because everyone benefited from it working. It's tempting to romanticize this world. It wasn't perfect. The palace economies were hierarchical, sometimes oppressive. Most people worked for the palaces, their labor directed from above, their surplus production confiscated as taxes. Slavery existed. War was common, though usually limited to border disputes and competitions for vassal states rather than total war aimed at destruction. Women, in most places, had limited rights and opportunities. This was still the ancient world with all its inequalities and brutalities. But within those limitations, the Late Bronze Age had achieved something extraordinary. They'd built a world that worked, a system of international relations that prevented major wars between the great powers for centuries, an economic network that delivered prosperity, at least to the urban centres and the elite, a cultural flowering that produced art and literature and architecture that we still admire today. They'd solved problems of coordination and cooperation on a scale that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years, and they felt permanent. If you'd been alive in 1300 BCE, walking through Mycenae or Hattusa or Thebes, you would have assumed this world would last forever. The palaces felt eternal, their walls built to withstand any siege. The trading ships had been sailing the same routes for hundreds of years. The diplomatic protocols had been refined over generations. This was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked, as far as anyone could remember, how it would always work. They had no idea that within a century almost all of it would be gone. The first signs of trouble show up in the archives. Letters between kings that shift from routine diplomatic exchanges to something more urgent. Around 1225 BCE, the tone changes. The Hittite king writes to the king of Ugarit demanding ships and men. Not requesting, demanding. There's an edge of desperation you don't see in earlier correspondence. Something is happening at the edges of the empire. Raiders, possibly. Crop failures. Unrest. The letters don't specify clearly, but the urgency is palpable. Then the letters stop coming from certain places. Cities that used to send regular diplomatic correspondence go silent. At first, this might not seem unusual. Messages get lost, ships sink, messengers are delayed. But the silence spreads like a disease moving through a body. One city stops writing, then another, and when contact is finally re-established with some of these places, what you learn is chilling. They're gone. Not conquered and occupied by someone else, just gone. Abandoned or destroyed, the population scattered or dead. Hattusa, the great Hittite capital, is one of the first to fall. We don't know exactly when or exactly how. The archaeological evidence shows the city was systematically dismantled sometime around 1200 BCE. Not destroyed in a single catastrophic fire, which would have been easier to understand. Instead, someone took the time to dismantle the fortifications. The massive walls that had protected the city for centuries were pulled down. The palaces were stripped. Valuables were removed. Then what remained was burned. Who did this? The Hittites themselves might have done it. There's a theory that when the empire collapsed, when the central government lost control, the king ordered the capital destroyed to prevent enemies from using it. A scorched earth policy on a monumental scale. Or maybe enemies did sack the city, and the systematic dismantling was their work, taking apart the symbols of Hittite power stone by stone. We don't know. What we know is that by 1100 BCE, Hattusa was empty. The streets where merchants had haggled and officials had hurried on palace business were silent. The archives where thousands of tablets recorded the business of empire sat abandoned. The great temples stood roofless, open to the sky, and the Hittite empire simply ceased to exist. A kingdom that had been one of the great powers for 400 years vanished so completely that when the Hebrew Bible mentioned the Hittites, later scholars thought it was a mistake, that no such people had ever existed. It wasn't until the late 1800s, when archaeologists started excavating Hattusa and found the archives, that we even knew the Hittites had been a major power. They'd been erased from memory so thoroughly that they became myth. While Anatolia was falling apart, the Mycenaean world was starting to burn. The palace at Pylos on the western coast of the Peloponnese gives us one of the clearest pictures of what the final days looked like. The Linear B tablets found there, preserved when the palace burned, show a society mobilizing for defense in its last moments. Tablets record the deployment of rowers to coastal watch stations. Others list bronze being collected from throughout the kingdom, presumably to make weapons. There are inventories that seem to show preparations for siege, stockpiling food, moving valuable goods to secure locations. Then Pylos burned. The date is hard to pin down exactly, but sometime around 1200 BCE, fire swept through the palace complex. The flames were hot enough to bake the clay tablets, which is the only reason they survived. Everything else, the wooden beams, the painted plaster, the furniture and textiles and everything organic, burned. The people who worked in that palace, who pressed those last desperate administrative records into clay, they died or fled. The palace was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned. And unlike Hattusa, where we at least have theories about systematic dismantling, Pylos looks like it fell to sudden violence. No time for careful evacuation, just fire and destruction, and then silence. Mycenae itself, the most powerful of the Greek palace centres, held out longer. But sometime around 1150 BCE, it too fell. The massive fortification walls that had protected it weren't enough. The palace burned. The town that surrounded it was destroyed or abandoned. When people eventually resettled the site, they were living in a much simpler way. No palaces, no linear bee administration, no international trade, just small communities eking out a living from agriculture. Their connection to the cosmopolitan Bronze Age world completely severed. Tiryns burned, Thebes burned, Glar burned. Across Greece, within the span of maybe 50 years, the entire palace system collapsed. Some sites show evidence of earthquake damage before the fires, which has led some scholars to think a sequence of earthquakes might have weakened these kingdoms before human enemies delivered the final blow. But the pattern is unmistakable. The Mycenaean world, which had been trading with Egypt and the Levant and Anatolia for centuries, which had built those massive stone fortifications and elaborate palaces and sophisticated bureaucracies, it all ended. And here's what makes it particularly tragic. At Pylos, those last tablets show the palace administration still functioning, still keeping records, still trying to organise defence right up until the moment the fires started. They thought they could survive whatever was coming. They were wrong. Meanwhile, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Syrian and Levantine cities were facing their own catastrophes. Ugarit, that prosperous port city, sent desperate letters in its final days. One letter, found in the ruins, is from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia on Cyprus. "The enemy ships are already here," he writes. "They have set fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. All my troops are stationed in Hittite territory and all my ships are in Lycian waters. The country is thus abandoned to itself." You can feel the panic in those words, the realization that help isn't coming, that the troops are somewhere else, deployed on what seemed like important missions when they left, now uselessly far away while the home city burns. And then, nothing. That's one of the last documents from Ugarit. The city was destroyed so thoroughly that it was never reoccupied. Today it's an archaeological site called Ras Shamra, layers of ash and destruction marking the moment when Bronze Age Ugarit simply ended. Alalak burned, Emar burned. Sites across Syria show the same destruction layers, the same sudden violent ends. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a cascade, a wave of destruction rolling across the eastern Mediterranean. And what makes it so puzzling is that we can't always identify who was doing the destroying. Sometimes there's evidence of fire and violent destruction, but no evidence of new occupants. The cities were destroyed and then left empty. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this was conquest, why didn't the conquerors move in and take over? If it was just raiding, why was it so thorough, so total? Egypt survived, but barely. We have more evidence from Egypt than from anywhere else because Egyptian records were carved in stone, rather than written on clay or papyrus, and stone survives. The temple at Medinet Habu, built by Rameses III, has walls covered with inscriptions describing invasions by groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. The reliefs show naval, battles, enemies with strange headdresses and weapons arriving in ships, bringing their families and possessions with them as if they were migrating rather than just raiding. Rameses III fought these invaders in a series of battles around 1177 BCE. He claims to have defeated them utterly, thrown back the invasion, saved Egypt. And to an extent he did. Egypt didn't fall. The pharaonic system continued, but the cost was enormous. The wars drained the treasury. The disruption of trade networks cut Egypt off from resources it depended on. The following decade saw declining royal power, internal strife, eventually the end of the New Kingdom and the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, an era of division and weakness that lasted centuries. And even in his moment of triumph, Rameses III's inscriptions reveal something unsettling. He lists the kingdoms and peoples that the Sea Peoples destroyed before they got to Egypt: Hatti, the Hittite kingdom, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, Alashia. He's essentially providing a catalogue of the fallen world. and his message seems to be, everyone else fell, but we stood firm, which is true. But it's also an admission that the world Egypt had known, the network of great kingdoms and trading partners, was gone. Egypt had survived, but it was surviving alone in a much diminished, much more dangerous world. Cyprus was devastated. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction around 1200 BCE. Cities burned. The copper production that had been the island's economic foundation nearly stopped. Population crashed. Some sites were abandoned entirely, others were resettled, but by much smaller communities living in simpler ways. The elaborate palace economies, the international trade, all of it ended. And then there's the question of who these sea peoples actually were. The Egyptian inscriptions name them Peleset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Sherden, Denian, Weshesh. Names that might correspond to later known peoples, the Philistines possibly being descendants of the Peleset, the Shekelesh may be connected to Sicily. But where they came from originally, what drove them to move in such numbers that they could threaten Egypt itself, we don't know for certain. Were they refugees fleeing the collapse of Mycenaean Greece? Were they raiders taking advantage of weakened kingdoms? Were they themselves the cause of the collapse, or just one symptom of a much larger crisis? The more you examine the evidence, the less clear it becomes. They might have been all of these things. Refugees who became raiders, who became migrants looking for new lands because their old homes were uninhabitable. People caught up in cascading failures they didn't understand and couldn't control. What's certain is the aftermath. By 1100 BCE, the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age was gone. The trade networks had collapsed. Ships stopped sailing the regular routes because the ports they'd sailed to were destroyed or impoverished, no longer able to trade. The tin supplies from Central Asia stopped flowing, or at least stopped reaching the Mediterranean. Without tin, you can't make bronze. Without bronze, you can't make the tools and weapons that Bronze Age civilization depended on. The entire economic system seized up like an engine that's lost its lubricating oil. In Greece, the collapse was so complete that writing disappeared. Linear B, which had been used to administer the palace economies, was forgotten. When Greeks started writing again, centuries later, they used a completely different system, the alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians. 400 years of illiteracy. 400 years during which nothing was written down, no records were kept, no literature was composed that we know of. Later Greeks remembered this period through oral poetry, the epics of Homer that tell stories of the Mycenaean age in garbled, half-legendary form, Agamemnon and Achilles and Odysseus, heroes of a world that seemed impossibly grander than the Iron Age present. But the actual history, the names of real kings, the details of what happened and when, all of that was lost. Population crashed. In Greece, estimates suggest the population fell from around 300,000 at the height of the Late Bronze Age to maybe 40,000 by the depths of the Dark Age. That's not just economic collapse, that's demographic catastrophe. People died from violence, from starvation, from disease that spread through weakened, malnourished populations. Others fled, migrating to areas less affected by whatever was destroying their homelands. The archaeological record shows abandoned settlements, sites that had been occupied for centuries left empty, reclaimed by wild vegetation. The cities that survived were shadows of their former selves. Athens, which later would become the greatest of Greek city-states, was in the Bronze Age a relatively minor settlement. It survived the collapse, but only as a small community, nothing like the palace centres that had dominated Mycenaean Greece. Why Athens survived when Mycenaean Pylos fell is unclear. Maybe its relative insignificance saved it, making it not worth attacking. Maybe its access to water and defensive position helped. Maybe just luck. By 1050 BCE, the Great Age of Bronze was over. The palaces were ruins, the trade networks were broken. The great kings who had called each other brother were dead or forgotten, their kingdoms dissolved. The scribes who had kept such careful records were gone, their skills lost. The merchants who had sailed from port to port carrying goods from across the known world, they'd found other work or died trying to maintain routes that no longer made economic sense. The world had simplified drastically. People still lived, still farmed, still made pottery and tools, but they made them locally, simply, without the specialization and trade that had characterized the Bronze Age. Instead of elaborate palace economies redistributing goods across kingdoms, you had village economies where everyone knew everyone else. where production was for local use, where the outside world was distant and dangerous rather than a source of opportunity and wealth. And the strangest thing about this collapse is how thorough it was. Not in the sense that everyone died, obviously people survived, but in the sense that the entire system, the whole interconnected world, just ceased to function. It wasn't replaced by something else. It wasn't conquered by a new empire that imposed a new order. It just fragmented into smaller, simpler, more isolated communities that had lost contact with each other and with the wider world. Imagine being alive during this transition. Imagine being a merchant who remembered when you could sail to Cyprus or Egypt, sell your goods, buy exotic imports, and sail home wealthy. Now the ports are destroyed or hostile, the trade goods aren't available, the customers are impoverished or dead, your skills are worthless. Or imagine being a scribe trained in the complex linear B system, able to read and write, a valuable skill that gave you status and employment. Now the palaces that employed you are burned. Nobody needs records kept because there's nothing to record. The ability to read and write, which had been so valuable, is suddenly useless. And you watch your children grow up illiterate because there's no point teaching them skills nobody uses anymore. Within a single human lifetime, everything changed. The world went from cosmopolitan and interconnected to isolated and poor, from literate to illiterate, from bronze to, eventually, iron, though that transition took time and happened unevenly, from palace economies to village subsistence. It must have felt like the end of the world. In a very real sense it was, and the mystery remains, what caused it? Why did it all fall apart at once? Why couldn't any of these kingdoms, powerful and sophisticated as they were, survive whatever crisis they faced? That's what we need to explore next. The theories, the evidence, the attempts to understand what could bring down an entire civilization, an entire interconnected world in the span of a few generations. So what happened? What could cause such widespread simultaneous collapse? Scholars have been asking these questions for over a century, and the answers they've proposed reveal as much about how we think about catastrophe as they do about the actual events of 3,200 years ago. The oldest theory, and for a long time the dominant one, points to those mysterious sea peoples. The logic seems straightforward. Egyptian records describe invasions by foreign groups. Those invasions coincide with the collapse. Therefore, the sea peoples must have caused it. They swept across the Mediterranean and Near East like a tidal wave, destroying everything in their path. Simple, dramatic, easy to visualize. But the more closely you examine this theory, the less sense it makes. Start with the basic question. Who were these sea peoples? The Egyptian inscriptions give names. The Peliset, who might be the Philistines mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, later settling in coastal Palestine. The Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Shurden, the Denian, the Weshesh. But these names don't tell us where they came from, or what drove them to move in such numbers. Some scholars have suggested they were Mycenaean Greeks, refugees from the collapse of the palace economies, taking to the sea as raiders and migrants. Others think they came from Anatolia, displaced by the Hittite collapse. Still others propose they were a coalition of different groups from various regions, united by desperation or opportunity. The problem is we don't have their perspective. We only have the Egyptian version of events, and the Egyptians weren't particularly interested in understanding who these people were. They were enemies, threats to be defeated and repelled. That's what mattered. And here's where the theory really starts to break down. If the sea peoples were powerful enough to destroy the Hittite Empire, to burn the Mycenaean palaces, to devastate Cyprus and the Levantine coast, why couldn't they defeat Egypt? Rameses III claims to have thrown them back decisively. His inscriptions describe great victories, enemy ships sunk, enemy warriors slain by the thousands. If we believe his account, Egypt successfully defended itself. But if Egypt could defeat them, why couldn't the Hittites? The Hittite military was formidable, their fortifications massive. Why couldn't the Mycenaean kingdoms, protected by those Cyclopean walls, hold out? And if the sea peoples were conquerors, why didn't they settle and rule the territories they conquered? Most of the destroyed cities weren't occupied by new populations. They were just destroyed and abandoned. This has led many scholars to rethink the whole sea peoples narrative. Maybe they weren't the cause of the collapse. Maybe they were a symptom. Maybe they were refugees, populations displaced by droughts or famines or local conflicts, who took to the sea because their homelands couldn't support them anymore. In that reading, they didn't destroy the Bronze Age world. The Bronze Age world was already collapsing, and the Sea Peoples were just one group of survivors trying to find somewhere safe to live. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu actually support this interpretation. They show the invaders arriving in ships, yes, but they also show ox carts full of women and children and household goods. This doesn't look like a military invasion. This looks like migration. Whole communities on the move, bringing everything they owned, looking for new lands to settle. They fought when they had to, when they encountered resistance. But conquest might not have been their goal. Survival was. So if the Sea Peoples didn't cause the collapse, what did? Another theory looks not at human enemies but at climate. And the evidence here is compelling in ways that the Sea Peoples theory isn't, because we can measure ancient climate. We can extract it from lake sediment cores, from ice cores in Greenland, from tree ring data, from pollen samples preserved in bogs. And what this paleoclimate data shows is that around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought. Not a drought that lasted a year or two, a drought that lasted generations, possibly centuries. Lake sediment cores from the region show a dramatic shift around 1300 BCE. The pollen record changes. Trees that need consistent moisture decline. Drought-resistant plants increase. The lake levels dropped. Some lakes in the region that had been permanent for thousands of years dried up completely. This wasn't a normal dry spell. This was a fundamental climate shift, the kind of change that would have devastated agricultural societies dependent on consistent rainfall. And agriculture was the foundation of everything in the Bronze Age. The palace economies depended on surplus grain production. You needed enough food to feed not just the farmers, but also the artisans, the scribes, the soldiers, the priests, all the specialized workers who didn't produce their own food. A few bad harvests could be managed by drawing on stored reserves. But a drought lasting decades, reserves would run out, famine would spread. And when people are starving, social structures break down fast. Imagine you're a farmer in Mycenaean Greece around 1250 BCE. For the last 20 years, the rains have been unreliable. Some years they come late. Some years they barely come at all. Your crops are failing more often than they succeed. The palace still demands its share of what you produce, but there's less and less to share. You're hungry. Your children are hungry. And you hear rumours that other regions are facing the same problems, that everywhere the harvests are failing, that even Egypt is struggling. What do? Maybe you migrate, abandoning your land to search for somewhere with better prospects. Maybe you resist the palace's demands for taxes, keeping more of your meagre harvest for yourself. Maybe you join with others in similar circumstances and raid neighbouring territories, trying to take by force what you can't produce through farming. Any of these responses would destabilise the existing order. Multiply them across thousands of communities, and you get social collapse. The drought theory also explains why the collapse was so widespread. A climate shift would have affected the entire region simultaneously. It would have created food shortages in Egypt, in the Hittite lands, in Greece, in Syria, all at once. And in a world where kingdoms depended on each other for trade, where grain shipments from Egypt might feed populations in Greece, a simultaneous drought everywhere would mean nobody could help anyone else. The mutual support that made the system resilient in normal times became irrelevant when everyone was struggling simultaneously. But climate doesn't explain everything. Some of the destroyed cities show no signs of slow decline, no gradual abandonment you'd expect from drought-induced famine. They show evidence of sudden, violent destruction, buildings burned, fortifications breached, people killed. This looks like warfare, not climate-driven migration, which brings us to another theory. Earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on complex active fault lines. Earthquakes are common. Usually they're small, manageable, but occasionally you get big ones, catastrophic quakes that level cities and kill thousands. And very occasionally you get what seismologists call earthquake storms, sequences of major earthquakes occurring over a relatively short period, each triggered by stress changes caused by previous quakes. A geologist named Amos Nuer has argued that an earthquake storm hit the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. He points to archaeological evidence of earthquake damage at many of the sites that were destroyed during this period. Walls collapsed in ways consistent with seismic activity. Buildings show structural damage that looks like earthquake rather than fire or siege damage. At some sites, the destruction layers contain evidence of both earthquake and fire, suggesting the quakes triggered fires that finished what the shaking started. If you've ever experienced a major earthquake, you know how terrifying they are. The ground, which should be solid and stable, becomes liquid. Buildings that seem permanent crumble. The psychological impact is profound. Now imagine a sequence of major earthquakes over the span of a few decades. Each time you rebuild, another quake destroys your work. Fortifications you thought were strong enough to protect you crack and fall. The sense of security, of permanence, that allows civilizations to function, it's shattered. Earthquakes could explain the sudden destruction of cities without requiring massive military invasions. They could explain why so many sites were abandoned rather than rebuilt. People might have decided the locations were cursed or simply too risky to reoccupy. And earthquake storms can affect large regions, potentially explaining the widespread nature of the collapse. But earthquakes don't explain all the evidence either. Some destroyed cities show no clear signs of seismic damage. And while earthquakes can be devastating locally, it's hard to see how they could bring down an entire interconnected civilization. Civilizations rebuild after earthquakes all the time. Modern Turkey experiences major quakes regularly but doesn't collapse. Ancient Rome survived numerous earthquakes. Why would Bronze Age kingdoms be different? This is where we need to talk about systems theory and network collapse, because maybe the question isn't what single thing caused the collapse. Maybe the question is why the system was so fragile that any combination of stresses could bring it down. Think about how the Bronze Age world functioned. It was a network. Not a single unified empire, but a web of connections. Trade routes linking Cyprus to Egypt to Greece to Anatolia. Diplomatic relationships binding kingdoms in mutual obligations. Economic dependencies where one region produced copper, another produced tin, and both were needed to make bronze. Cultural exchanges spreading technologies and ideas. This network created prosperity and stability. But it also created vulnerability. Network theorists study how interconnected systems fail. And one thing they've discovered is that highly connected networks can be simultaneously very robust and very fragile. Robust because connections provide redundancy. If one trade route is disrupted, you can use another. If one kingdom falls, others can step in. But fragile because connections also spread disruptions. If enough nodes in the network fail, the whole system can cascade into collapse. Imagine the Bronze Age trade network as a web. Each city, each kingdom is a node in the web. Each trade route, each diplomatic relationship is a strand connecting nodes. The web is strong because of all these connections, but start cutting strands. A drought disrupts agricultural production in one region, cutting its trade connections because it has nothing to export. An earthquake destroys a major port, cutting maritime trade routes. Political instability in another kingdom makes it an unreliable trading partner. Pirates or raiders make certain sea lanes too dangerous to use. At first, the network adapts, trade reroutes around disrupted nodes. But there's a threshold. Cut enough strands and the web stops being a web. It fragments into isolated pieces, and once fragmentation starts, it accelerates. Each broken connection makes the remaining network more vulnerable. Eventually you reach a cascading failure, where the collapse of one node triggers the collapse of connected nodes, which triggers further collapses until the entire system disintegrates. This is what might have happened in the Late Bronze Age. Not one cause, but multiple simultaneous stresses: drought reducing agricultural surplus, earthquakes destroying infrastructure, migrations and raids disrupting trade routes. Internal social tensions as elites tried to maintain their lifestyles while common people starved. Each stress by itself might have been manageable. Together they overwhelmed the system's ability to adapt. And here's the thing about cascade failures. They can be triggered by relatively small initial disruptions if the system is already under stress. Think about the financial crisis of 2008. It started with housing market problems in one country, but spread globally because financial networks connected everyone. Banks that had never made subprime mortgages collapsed because they were connected to banks that had. The trigger was specific, but the cascade was systematic. The Bronze Age collapse might have worked the same way. Maybe it started with drought in one region. That region stopped exporting grain. Kingdoms that depended on those grain imports faced famine. Famine led to social unrest, which led to reduced production of other goods. Those goods weren't available for trade, so other kingdoms that depended on them suffered. Round and round, each disruption causing further disruptions, until the whole system locked up. There's also the factor of complexity itself. An archaeologist named Joseph Tainter has argued that civilizations collapse when the cost of maintaining complexity exceeds its benefits. Complex societies need constant inputs of energy and resources to maintain their structure. All those palace administrators, all those scribes and soldiers and specialized craftsmen, they all need to be fed and paid and housed. That requires surplus production. It requires organization and coordination. When times are good, complexity pays for itself. The benefits of specialized production, of trade, of organized defense outweigh the costs. But when times get hard, complexity becomes a burden. You still have to feed all those non-producers, but there's less surplus to feed them with. The palace bureaucracy still demands its taxes, but people have less to give. Eventually, maintaining the complex system becomes impossible. It simplifies rapidly, often catastrophically, down to a level of organization that can be sustained with available resources. This might explain why the palace economies collapsed, but people survived. The palaces, with their huge administrative apparatuses and dependent populations, were too complex to maintain during crisis. They needed constant inflows of resources that drought and trade disruption made impossible, so they collapsed. But village-level organization, where people directly produced their own food and needed minimal administration, that could survive. It was simpler, less efficient, less prosperous. But it was sustainable. Then there's the possibility of internal social conflict. Some scholars have suggested that the Bronze Age kingdoms faced rebellions, that lower classes rose up against the palace elites who controlled the economy. There's some evidence for this. At several sites the palaces were destroyed, but ordinary houses survived. This could indicate targeted violence against symbols of elite power, rather than general warfare or natural disaster. If drought was causing famine, if trade disruption was causing economic hardship, the people suffering most would have been the common farmers and labourers, not the palace elites. Elites could use their power to claim a larger share of diminishing resources, protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. This would create resentment, eventually boiling over into violence. The palaces burned not because of foreign invaders, but because the people who'd been exploited by those palaces finally had enough. This theory is harder to prove because, ancient records were kept by the elites, and they wouldn't necessarily record their own unpopularity or the grievances of common people. But it fits with patterns we see in other historical collapses. When systems under stress prioritize elite survival over general welfare, social bonds break down. People stop supporting institutions that don't support them. The loyalty that holds complex societies together dissolves. So where does this leave us? With a lot of theories and no single answer. Most scholars today think the collapse was multifactorial, a perfect storm of climate change, earthquake damage, trade disruption, migration pressures, social unrest, and systemic fragility. Each factor amplified the others. Drought made kingdoms less resilient to earthquake damage. Earthquake damage disrupted trade networks. Trade disruption reduced resources available to maintain social order. Social disorder made kingdoms vulnerable to raiders and migrants. Raiders and migrants put additional stress on already struggling agricultural systems, round and round in a vicious cycle that nobody could stop. What's fascinating is that nobody at the time would have understood it this way. They wouldn't have seen systems collapse or cascade failure or network fragility. They would have seen enemies at the gates, famines, earthquakes, signs of divine anger perhaps. Each kingdom probably thought their problems were unique to them, local issues requiring local solutions. They wouldn't have realized they were all caught in the same collapsing system, that their fates were linked by the very connections that had previously made them strong. And maybe that's the most important insight. The things that make systems resilient in good times can make them vulnerable in bad times. The trade networks that spread prosperity also spread disruption. The specialization that created wealth also created dependencies. The complexity that enabled achievement also created fragility. There's no villain in this story, no evil empire or rampaging horde that destroyed civilization. Just a system that worked until it didn't, and a world that couldn't adapt fast enough when conditions changed. The evidence keeps accumulating. New excavations reveal new details. Climate science provides better data about ancient weather patterns. Genetic studies trace population movements we couldn't see before. Each discovery adds nuance to our understanding, but the core mystery remains. How do you destroy an entire world? The answer seems to be that you don't have to. Under the right conditions, worlds destroy themselves, but theories are just interpretations until you have evidence, and the evidence is there, buried in the ground, waiting to be excavated. The thing about archaeology is that it's not about grand narratives or sweeping theories. It's about dirt and stones and broken pottery. It's about layers of ash and the placement of walls and the contents of storage jars. It's about looking at what's actually there and trying to understand what it means. Let's start with the most common finding across dozens of sites: fire. Not just small fires, cooking fires or accidental blazes that damaged a building or two, massive conflagrations that consumed entire cities. When archaeologists excavate Bronze Age sites that were destroyed during the collapse, they find destruction layers, thick bands of ash and burned debris separating the Bronze Age levels from whatever came after. At Pylos, the destruction layer is dramatic. The palace, with all its administrative complexity, all its painted frescoes and storage magazines and craftsmen's quarters, burned so intensely that the clay tablets were baked hard. Under normal circumstances, linear B tablets weren't fired. They were sun-dried clay, meant to be temporary records that could be recycled after a year or two when the information was no longer needed. But when the palace burned, the fire reached temperatures high enough to turn those soft clay tablets into ceramic. It preserved them accidentally, turned temporary administrative records into permanent archaeological evidence. Those tablets tell stories if you know how to read them, and the tablets from Pylos's final days are revealing. Some record the deployment of rowers, men assigned to coastal watching stations. The exact wording suggests urgency, a mobilization happening quickly. Other tablets list bronze being collected from religious sanctuaries across the kingdom. Bronze dedications to the gods, accumulated over years or decades, being recalled to the palace, presumably to be melted down and reforged into weapons. These aren't the records of a kingdom at peace. These are the records of a kingdom preparing for war, or at least preparing for defense. The administrators at Pylos knew something was coming. They were trying to gather resources, mobilize defenders, make ready for an attack. But whatever preparations they made weren't enough. The palace burned. The people scattered or died, and those last desperate administrative measures were preserved in the fire that ended everything. The same pattern appears at other Mycenaean sites. At Tiryns, at Mycenae itself, excavations reveal destruction layers with massive amounts of burned material. Not just wood, though the timber roofing and wooden supports all burned, but also evidence that goods stored in the palaces burned with them. Oil jars shattered in the heat, their contents feeding the flames. Textile workshops where finished cloth and raw materials went up in smoke. Food stores reduced to charred remains. And here's what makes it particularly striking. At many sites, there's evidence that the fires burned so hot they damaged the stone itself. Limestone blocks that had stood for centuries show heat damage, the surface cracked and discoloured. Plaster that had been carefully smoothed and painted bubbled and fell off in chunks. Bronze objects melted. Not just small items, but large bronze vessels, and even architectural fittings. The temperatures must have been extraordinary. Was this deliberate? Did attackers set fires systematically, or did accidental fires spread out of control during fighting? The evidence doesn't always make it clear. But the thoroughness of the destruction at many sites suggests intentionality. If you wanted to render a palace complex unusable, to destroy it so completely that it could never be reoccupied, you'd do exactly what the archaeological record shows. Burn everything that can burn, damage everything that can't. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the evidence is different but equally telling. The city wasn't destroyed in a single catastrophic fire. Instead, it shows signs of systematic dismantling. The massive fortification walls built from huge stone blocks that had protected the city for centuries were pulled down. Someone invested significant effort in destroying these fortifications block by block. The temples and palaces were stripped of valuables, then burned. But it's the methodical nature of it that's striking. Some scholars think the Hittites themselves did this. When it became clear the empire was collapsing, when the king could no longer control the territories or protect the capital, the decision might have been made to abandon Hattusa and ensure enemies couldn't use it. A scorched earth policy on a monumental scale. Better to destroy it themselves than let invaders claim it. The archives at Hattusa survived, at least partially. Thousands of clay tablets recording centuries of Hittite administration, diplomacy and culture. They were found in the ruins, some still in their original storage rooms. These tablets tell us about the last days of the empire indirectly. There are treaties with vassal states, letters to and from other kingdoms, administrative records. But then there's a terminus, a point beyond which no new tablets appear. The records simply stop. Among the latest tablets are letters that show the empire under stress, the king demanding troops and ships from vassals, references to food shortages, complaints about regions not sending their required tribute. The tone is different from earlier correspondence, more desperate, more urgent. And then silence. No records of what happened in the final weeks or months, just the evidence of systematic destruction and abandonment. Moving south to the Levantine coast, to cities like Ugarit, the archaeological picture becomes even more dramatic. Ugarit was excavated extensively in the 20th century, and what emerged from the ground was a wealthy port city with international connections. The houses of merchants contained goods from across the Mediterranean, Egyptian amulets, Mycenaean pottery, Cypriot copper ingots, evidence of a thriving trade economy, but above the prosperous Bronze Age level sits a destruction layer. And in that layer, archaeologists found something extraordinary. Tablets, letters, documents that were being written or processed when the city was destroyed. One of these is that letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Al-Ashir, the one that says the enemy ships are already here, the cities are burning, the troops are stationed elsewhere and can't help. This isn't historical reconstruction. This is the eyewitness account, a primary source describing the attack as it was happening. Another tablet from Ugarit is even more poignant. It's a letter to someone, we're not entirely sure who, and it simply says, "Send help, quickly, we are in danger." That's it. No elaboration, no diplomatic niceties, just a desperate plea that either never got sent or arrived too late to matter. The city burned. Everything the tablets describe, the enemy ships, the fires, the danger, it all happened. The archaeological evidence confirms it. At Ugarit and other coastal sites, there's also evidence of hasty burials. In some cases, bodies were found in unusual locations, not in proper cemeteries, but in houses or even in the streets. This suggests people were being buried quickly, perhaps during a siege, perhaps in the chaotic aftermath of an attack. Proper burial rites, which were important in Bronze Age culture, were abandoned in favour of just getting the dead underground as quickly as possible. There are also bodies that weren't buried at all, skeletons found in positions suggesting violent death, then left where they fell. This is unusual for the Bronze Age Mediterranean, where burial customs were generally observed even in difficult circumstances. The presence of unburied dead suggests such complete social breakdown that even basic cultural practices couldn't be maintained. The fortifications themselves tell stories. At many Mycenaean sites, there's evidence of last-minute fortification efforts. At Mycenae, sections of the massive walls show hasty repairs or reinforcements. Someone was trying to strengthen the defences, presumably in response to a perceived threat. At Tiryns, similar evidence exists of fortification work that appears to have been done quickly, without the usual care given to major construction projects. Some sites show evidence of attempts to secure water supplies. Underground cisterns, passages leading to springs, systems designed to allow a city to withstand siege. This suggests people knew attacks were coming and were trying to prepare. But the preparations weren't enough. The cities fell anyway. And then there's the evidence from what didn't survive. The absence of things can be as telling as their presence. At many destroyed palace sites, archaeologists find almost no valuables in the ruins. No gold or silver jewellery, no precious objects, no hoards of wealth that palaces would have accumulated over decades or centuries. This suggests several possibilities. Maybe looters took everything of value after the destruction. Maybe the inhabitants themselves fled with whatever portable wealth they could carry. Maybe palace administrators saw the collapse coming and evacuated valuables to secure locations we haven't found yet. But what did survive in many cases were the mundane items. Pottery storage jars, tools, loom weights from textile workshops, the everyday objects of Bronze Age life, not valuable enough to loot or carry away, but enormously valuable to archaeologists because they show how people actually lived. And what they show is that life ended abruptly. At Pylos, storage jars were found still containing food residue. At Hattusa, granaries held grain. These weren't cities that had been gradually abandoned over years as resources dwindled. These were cities where people expected to come back. The material record also shows the collapse of trade networks with striking clarity. Pottery is one of the best indicators because it's durable, it's common, and different regions had distinctive styles. In late Bronze Age levels at sites across the Mediterranean, you find pottery from all over: Mycenaean pottery in Egypt, Cypriot pottery in Greece, Canaanite transport amphoras at Mycenaean palaces. This ceramic evidence maps the trade networks, shows you who was trading with whom. Then, in the levels immediately after the collapse, that diversity vanishes. At Greek sites, you suddenly find only locally made pottery, no more imports from Cyprus or the Levant. At Levantine sites, no more Mycenaean imports. The networks that had moved goods across thousands of miles just stopped functioning, and the pottery that was being made locally often shows a decline in quality. Less skilled craftsmanship, simpler decorative schemes, sometimes handmade pottery replacing wheel-made, a technological regression. This isn't just about pottery. The same pattern appears with other materials. In pre-collapse levels, you find bronze tools and weapons everywhere. In post-collapse levels, bronze becomes rare. Iron starts appearing, at first as a rare, almost precious material, then gradually becoming more common. This shift from bronze to iron is partly about technology, iron-working techniques slowly spreading. But it's also about necessity. Without reliable access to copper and tin through trade networks, you can't make bronze. You have to find alternatives. Recent archaeological work has added new dimensions to our understanding. Underwater archaeology in particular has revealed things that land excavations can't. Off the coast of Turkey and the Levant, archaeologists have found Bronze Age shipwrecks that preserve cargo in ways that would be impossible on land. The Uluburun wreck, which we mentioned earlier, is the most famous, but there are others, and each one provides a snapshot of the trade networks at different points in time. Interestingly, there are very few shipwrecks from the period immediately after the collapse. This could mean fewer ships were sailing, which fits with the evidence of trade network collapse. Or it could mean ships were avoiding deep water, hugging coastlines where wrecks are harder to preserve or find. Either way, the pattern is striking. Active maritime trade before 1200 BCE, much less activity after. There's also been important work done with remote sensing technology. Satellite archaeology and ground-penetrating radar have revealed Bronze Age sites that weren't visible from ground level. Some of these sites show evidence of destruction during the collapse period. Others show abandonment without obvious violence. The technology is helping archaeologists understand settlement patterns, how many people lived in these regions, how those populations changed during the collapse. Genetic studies are starting to provide answers to questions archaeology alone couldn't address. DNA extracted from ancient skeletons can show population movements, can identify where people came from even when they left no written records. Some recent studies have analysed DNA from Philistine sites in coastal Palestine, sites that were established in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. The DNA shows European ancestry, supporting the idea that at least some of the sea peoples did come from the Aegean or Anatolia. Other genetic work has looked at continuity and change in populations. In Greece, despite the apparent severity of the collapse, genetic studies show continuity. The people living there during the Dark Ages were largely descended from Bronze Age populations. They didn't disappear, they didn't get replaced by invaders, they just lived differently in smaller communities with less complex social organisation. The environmental archaeology is equally revealing. Pollen cores extracted from lake and marsh sediments show changes in vegetation over time. In the late Bronze Age, the pollen record shows extensive agriculture, forests being cleared for farming, cultivation of grain and olives and grapes. Then, around 1200 BCE, the record changes. Agricultural pollen declines, wild vegetation increases. Some areas show complete abandonment of agriculture for decades or even centuries. This isn't just about drought, though drought is part of the picture. It's about population decline. Fewer people farming means more land reverting to wild state, and the pollen record shows this happened across large regions simultaneously. The collapse wasn't localized. It was widespread enough to leave a signal in the environmental record. Animal bones from archaeological sites tell similar stories. In prosperous Bronze Age levels, you find evidence of managed herds, selective breeding, animals being raised specifically for meat or milk or wool. In post-collapse levels, the evidence shows more hunting of wild animals, less evidence of managed herding. Again, this suggests economic regression, people returning to more basic subsistence strategies. But here's what's important to understand about all this evidence. It doesn't give us a simple narrative. It doesn't show one clear cause or one obvious sequence of events. What it shows is complexity, different. Sites have different evidence. Some show evidence of fire, some show earthquake damage, some show signs of systematic destruction, some were simply abandoned. The variety of evidence suggests the collapse played out differently in different places. There wasn't one catastrophe. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, each unique in its details, but all part of the same larger pattern. The tablets from Pylos showing military mobilization, the desperate letters from Ugarit, the systematic dismantling of Hattusa, the burned palaces of Mycenae and Tiryns, the pottery evidence of collapsed trade networks, the genetic evidence of population movements, the environmental evidence of agricultural abandonment. Put it all together and you get a picture of a world falling apart in multiple ways simultaneously. No single explanation fits all the evidence. But that's probably the point. Complex systems don't collapse simply. They collapse messily, chaotically, with different immediate causes in different locations, all contributing to the same overall outcome. And every year, new excavations add to what we know. Sites that haven't been dug yet might contain archives that explain things we're still puzzling over. Underwater sites might reveal more about the maritime aspects of the collapse. Genetic studies will continue to trace population movements and changes. Climate science will refine our understanding of ancient weather patterns. The story is still being written, still being excavated from the ground. What we have now is fragments, pieces of broken tablets, layers of ash, collapsed walls, the material remains of catastrophe. But these fragments are enough to show that something enormous happened, something that transformed the entire Mediterranean world. The evidence is there, in museum collections and archaeological reports, in databases of pottery types and genetic sequences, in climate reconstructions and carbon dates. The physical reality of the collapse, preserved in the ground, waiting for patient hands to uncover it, and patient minds to interpret what it means. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't unique. That's the unsettling part. When you start looking at history with this pattern in mind, when you start asking whether other periods show similar signs of synchronized collapse across multiple civilizations, you find them, again and again, as if there's something about how complex societies organize themselves that makes them vulnerable to the same kinds of cascading failures, separated by centuries but following eerily similar patterns. Jump forward 1800 years from the Bronze Age collapse. It's the 6th century of the Common Era, the year 536 to be specific, and something very strange is happening to the climate. Contemporary sources describe it. Byzantine historian Procopius writes that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for the whole year. John of Ephesus, another Byzantine writer, says the sun became dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Tree ring data confirms what the historical sources describe. The year 536 shows some of the worst growth conditions in the last 2,000 years. Ice core samples from Greenland show sulfate deposits, indicating a massive volcanic eruption, possibly 2 eruptions, in 536 and again in 540. The sulfur and ash ejected into the atmosphere blocked sunlight, causing global temperatures to drop. Crops failed, famine spread, and then came the plague. The plague of Justinian, named for the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who ruled during the outbreak, struck in 541. It was probably bubonic plague, the same disease that would later cause the Black Death in the 14th century. It spread through trade networks from Egypt across the Mediterranean world and into Europe and Asia. The death toll was catastrophic. Estimates range from 25 million to 50 million dead over the course of 2 centuries as the plague returned in waves. Procopius describes the plague in Constantinople. At its peak, he claims 10,000 people were dying every day, though that's probably an exaggeration. Bodies piled up because there weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug. When those filled, corpses were stuffed into the towers of the city's fortifications. The smell must have been overwhelming. The psychological impact incalculable. This happened during a time when Justinian was trying to reconquer the Western Roman Empire, trying to restore the Mediterranean unity that had existed before Rome's fall in the West a century earlier. The plague devastated those ambitions. Army after army was struck down not by enemy weapons but by disease. The tax base collapsed as populations died off. The resources needed to maintain Justinian's wars evaporated. But it wasn't just the Byzantine Empire that suffered. This was a synchronized crisis affecting civilizations across the known world, just like the Bronze Age collapse, just separated by 1800 years. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire faced its own catastrophes. The same volcanic dimming that affected Byzantium affected Persia. The same plague struck Persian cities. Wars between Byzantium and Persia, which had been ongoing for decades, intensified even as both empires were weakened by climate and disease. Resources that might have been used to respond to crisis were instead poured into armies and fortifications. Neither empire could afford these wars, but neither could afford to lose them either, so they bled each other while plague and famine did more damage than any army could. Meanwhile, in India, the Gupta Empire was collapsing. This was the classical age of Indian civilization, a period of remarkable cultural and scientific achievement. Mathematicians developing the concept of zero. Astronomers calculating the Earth's circumference with stunning accuracy. Poets and playwrights producing works that would influence Indian culture for millennia. But by the 6th century, the Gupta Empire was fragmenting. Central authority weakened. Regional powers asserted independence. The same climate disruptions that hit Byzantium and Persia hit India. The same plague might have reached there, though the evidence is less clear. Across the Pacific, something was happening to the Maya. The 6th century marks a hiatus in Maya monument construction. Cities that had been building elaborate temples and palaces suddenly stopped. Population seemed to decline in some regions. There's evidence of drought, of political instability, of warfare between city-states. Some scholars see this as a precursor to the more famous Maya collapse that would come later in the 9th and 10th centuries. But even this earlier crisis shows signs of being connected to the same climate disruptions affecting the Old World. Could volcanic eruptions in 536 and 540 have had global effects? Could they have triggered drought in Central America while causing cooling and crop failures in the Mediterranean and Asia? Climate science says yes. Major volcanic eruptions can affect global weather patterns. The sulfur compounds ejected into the stratosphere circulate worldwide, blocking sunlight everywhere. The effects can last years, so you have multiple civilizations on different continents with no direct contact in most cases, all experiencing crisis simultaneously. Climate disruption as the trigger, plague spreading through the connected regions of the Old World, political instability and warfare making everything worse, economic disruption as trade networks faltered, population decline as people died from disease and starvation or fled collapsing regions. Sound familiar? It's the Bronze Age collapse pattern again. Not identical in details, but similar in structure. Multiple simultaneous stresses overwhelming the adaptive capacity of complex societies. And just like the Bronze Age collapse, this 6th century crisis led to transformation. Byzantium survived but never fully recovered its ambition to reunite the Roman Empire. Persia survived but was weakened enough that when Arab Muslim armies emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, both Byzantium and Persia crumbled before them. The Gupta Empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms. The Maya rebuilt, but the classical period's unity was broken. Move forward another 1100 years, the 17th century, and again you see the pattern. Historians call it the general crisis of the 17th century, a period when civilizations across the world experienced simultaneous upheaval. In China, the Ming dynasty collapsed in 1644. This wasn't just a change of government, it was catastrophic. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that affected global climate from roughly 1400 to 1850, intensified in the 17th century. Northern China experienced severe drought. Harvests failed repeatedly, famine spread. The government, already strained by expensive wars against Manchu forces in the northeast and Japanese invasions of Korea, couldn't respond effectively. Peasant rebellions broke out, the most successful led by a man named Li Zicheng, who'd been a postal worker before drought, and government cutbacks left him unemployed. He joined a rebel group, rose through the ranks, eventually commanded an army. In 1644, he captured Beijing. The last Ming emperor hanged himself rather than face capture. Li proclaimed a new dynasty, but he held Beijing for only 40 days before Manchu forces, invited in by Ming generals hoping to suppress the rebellion, took the city and established the Qing dynasty. Millions died. Some estimates suggest the population of China fell by 40% during the Ming-Qing transition. Not all from direct violence. though there was plenty of that, mostly from famine and the diseases that spread through malnourished populations. The climate crisis made everything worse. Drought reduced harvests. Reduced harvests meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant the government couldn't maintain armies or relieve famine, which led to more rebellion, which caused more disruption. The cycle spiraled downward. At the same time, across the Eurasian landmass, Europe was tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, devastated Central Europe. It started as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states in the Holy Roman Empire, but expanded into a general European war that drew in Sweden, France, Spain, and dozens of German principalities. The destruction was immense. Some regions of Germany lost 60 to 80% of their population. Armies, both professional and mercenary, lived off the land, seizing crops and livestock, burning what they couldn't carry. Famine and disease followed the armies. Plague struck repeatedly. Villages were abandoned. Fields went unplanted. Wolves, nearly extinct in many regions, returned as human populations collapsed. And all of this was happening during the Little Ice Age. Colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, more crop failures. The climate added stress to societies already at war. In England, the same period saw the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. King Charles I was executed, the monarchy briefly abolished. The causes were complex, involving religion, taxation, political power. But the timing is notable. England's crisis happened alongside Europe's and China's. The Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding for 2 centuries, stalled. Internal rebellions erupted. The Salali revolts in Anatolia, driven partly by economic hardship and climate stress, killed hundreds of thousands. The empire survived but entered a long period of stagnation and eventual decline. In Mughal India, Emperor Shah Jahan's reign saw famines and rebellions. Resources were poured into monumental building projects, the Taj Mahal being the most famous, while peasants starved. The empire didn't collapse, but it was weakened, setting the stage for later fragmentation. Even in the Americas, isolated from the Old World's wars, there's evidence of stress. Pueblo peoples in the American Southwest faced drought and conflict in the 17th century, leading to migrations and cultural disruption. The pattern repeats: climate stress, political instability, warfare, economic disruption, population decline, different civilizations, different continents, simultaneous crisis. And the death tolls were staggering. Some estimates suggest 1/3 of the human population died during the 17th century crisis. That's more than both world wars combined, in relative terms. Go back further. Around 2200 BCE, another synchronized collapse. This one is called the 4.2 kiloyear event, because it shows up in climate records as an abrupt drying period that started 4200 years ago. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The age of pyramid building ended. The centralized state that had mobilized resources to construct those massive monuments fragmented. The first intermediate period began, a time of political division and economic decline. Climate records from the Nile show reduced flood levels, meaning less water for irrigation, smaller harvests, food shortages. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire collapsed around the same time. This was the world's first multi-ethnic empire, ruling over Sumerians, Akkadians, and other groups from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. At its height under Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin, it seemed invincible. Then it fell apart. Cities were abandoned. The capital, Akkad, was deserted so completely we still haven't found it. Texts from the period describe famine, invasion by mountain peoples, the collapse of order. The Indus Valley civilization, that sophisticated urban culture we mentioned earlier, began its decline around this time. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were gradually abandoned. The writing system was forgotten. The centralized authority that had maintained standard weights and measures and urban planning dissolved. Populations migrated eastward and southward, perhaps following the rivers as they changed course, perhaps fleeing drought. Evidence from lake cores and ocean sediment shows a severe drought lasting perhaps 2 centuries, affecting a vast region from the eastern Mediterranean through Mesopotamia to South Asia. The timing matches the collapses. Different civilizations, different cultures, different regions, all falling simultaneously because they all depended on climate systems that shifted at the same time. Why does this happen? Why do civilizations seem to collapse in clusters? The cynical answer is that maybe they don't, that we're seeing patterns that aren't really there, that collapses happen all the time and we're just noticing when they happen to coincide. But the evidence suggests something more than coincidence. Climate seems to be a common factor. Not the only factor, but a trigger that creates stress across large regions simultaneously. Volcanic eruptions can cause global cooling, leading to crop failures everywhere at once. Shifts in ocean currents or atmospheric circulation patterns can cause droughts that affect entire continents. When civilizations are already interconnected through trade, when they depend on stable climate for agriculture, when their social structures are complex and require surplus resources to maintain, climate disruption can trigger cascading failures across the entire system. But climate alone doesn't explain everything. Plenty of climate disruptions don't cause civilizations to collapse. The medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1300 CE, saw generally favorable climate in many regions, yet civilization still fell during that period. The Little Ice Age lasted from roughly 1400 to 1850, but the 17th century was particularly bad. Why? Because climate stress combined with other factors: war, disease, economic disruption, social unrest. It's the combination that matters. A well-governed society with strong institutions and social cohesion can weather climate stress. An already stressed society facing internal conflicts and economic problems can be pushed over the edge by climate disruption. And when multiple societies are connected through trade and diplomatic networks, stress in one can spread to others. Think about the 6th century. If the plague had struck a peaceful, prosperous world, civilizations might have recovered quickly, but it struck during a period of expensive wars, of religious conflicts, of societies already under strain. The plague didn't cause the problems, it multiplied them, made every existing stress worse. Same with the 17th century. The Little Ice Age created agricultural stress. That stress contributed to the conditions that sparked the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, the Ming collapse, the Ottoman Troubles. Then the wars made everything worse. Armies destroyed crops, refugees fled, spreading disease, trade networks broke down. Each problem amplified the others. This is what makes synchronized collapses possible. Not one cause, but a confluence of stresses. And when civilizations are connected, when they share climate zones or trade networks or even just similar social structures that have similar vulnerabilities, they can fall together. There's another factor worth considering. Complex societies have common failure modes. They all depend on agriculture producing surplus. They all need functioning trade networks. They all require central authorities capable of maintaining order and coordinating responses to crisis. When any of these systems fail, the whole structure becomes unstable, and different civilizations can be vulnerable to the same types of failures even if they're not directly connected. The Bronze Age collapse, the 6th century crisis, the 17th century troubles, the 4.2 kilo-year event. Different times, different civilizations, but similar patterns. Climate stress creating food shortages causing economic problems and social unrest. Unrest leading to conflict. Conflict disrupting trade and agriculture. Disruption causing more food shortage, round and round in a death spiral that complex societies can't escape once it starts. And here's what's unsettling. We're living in another period of climate change, global temperatures rising, weather patterns shifting, extreme events becoming more common. Our civilization is more complex than any that's come before, more interconnected, more dependent on global networks of trade and communication and resource flows. We're vulnerable in all the same ways previous civilizations were, and in new ways they never faced. Does that mean collapse is inevitable? No. Understanding these patterns gives us a chance to avoid them. We can see the warning signs, we can build resilience instead of just efficiency. We can maintain redundancy in critical systems. We can address climate change before it triggers the kinds of cascading failures that brought down previous civilizations. But the pattern is there, visible in the archaeological record, documented in historical sources, measurable in climate data. Civilizations have collapsed together before, multiple times, under similar conditions. It's not guaranteed to happen again. But it's not impossible either. The vulnerabilities that complex societies created for themselves 3,200 years ago, or 1,400 years ago, or 400 years ago, we've recreated those vulnerabilities on a global scale. We're all connected now, all dependent on the same climate, all vulnerable to the same kinds of cascading failures. The good news, if there is any, is that humanity survives these collapses. Civilizations fall, but people adapt. New societies emerge from the ruins. Knowledge is lost but eventually recovered or rediscovered. The cycle continues. But that's not much comfort if you're living through the collapse itself, watching everything you knew fall apart, uncertain if you'll survive to see what comes after. So we've seen the pattern. Civilizations collapsing together, separated by centuries but following similar trajectories. Climate stress, economic disruption, social breakdown, cascading failures. But why? Why does complexity itself seem to create vulnerability? Why do the same kinds of systems, built by different people in different eras, fail in similar ways? The answer lies in how networks function. And this isn't just ancient history. This is about the fundamental architecture of complex systems, whether we're talking about Bronze Age, trade routes, or modern financial markets or global supply chains. The principles are the same. The vulnerabilities are the same. Think about a spider's web. It's strong because it's connected. Each strand supports the others. You can break one strand and the web still functions. That's resilience through redundancy. But keep breaking strands and eventually you reach a threshold. The remaining strands can't support the structure anymore. The web doesn't gradually weaken. It catastrophically fails. One moment it's mostly intact. The next moment it's collapsed. This is how network systems work. They're robust until they're not. And the transition from robust to collapse can happen very quickly once you cross a critical threshold. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a web. Each city, each kingdom was a node. Each trade route, each diplomatic relationship was a strand connecting nodes. The web was strong. Cyprus produced copper. Afghanistan or somewhere in Central Asia produced tin. Mix them together and you get bronze. Egypt produced grain. The Levant produced timber and purple dye. Mycenaean Greece produced textiles and olive oil. Everyone specialized in what they did best, traded for what they needed. The system worked beautifully. But it created dependencies. Cyprus didn't produce its own tin. Egypt didn't have timber. The Mycenaean palaces couldn't feed their populations from local agriculture alone. Each node depended on connections to other nodes. This dependency was fine as long as the connections held. When they started breaking, the whole web became vulnerable. Imagine you're a palace administrator at Mycenae around 1250 BCE. Your job is to manage the economy, ensure everyone gets fed, maintain the workshops that produce the goods you trade. You need grain from Egypt or the Black Sea region because local production isn't sufficient. You need copper from Cyprus. You need tin from somewhere far away, you're not even sure exactly where, but it arrives through established trade networks. You need luxury goods to give as diplomatic gifts to maintain relationships with other kingdoms. Then the grain shipments from Egypt become unreliable. Drought there means they have less surplus to export. You can manage for a while by drawing on stored reserves, but the reserves aren't infinite. Then tin becomes scarce. The overland routes through Anatolia are disrupted by whatever's causing the Hittite Empire to fragment. You can't make bronze without tin. Your weapons production slows. Your tools wear out and can't be replaced. Now you're in a crisis. Food shortages mean people are hungry. Without bronze tools, agricultural production declines. Less production means less to trade, which means you can't import the grain you need. Less grain means more hunger. More hunger means social unrest. Unrest disrupts production further. You're in a downward spiral. And here's the critical point. You didn't create this crisis. You didn't do anything wrong. You were managing the system the same way it had been managed for generations. But the system was fragile in ways that weren't visible during good times. The dependencies that made you rich during prosperity made you vulnerable during crisis. This is what network theorists call a cascade failure. One disruption triggers another, which triggers another. In a tightly connected network, disruptions spread. If the network is robust with lots of redundancy and alternative pathways, it can absorb disruptions. But if the network is optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, if there aren't alternative pathways, then disruptions propagate rapidly. The Bronze Age network was optimized for efficiency. Trade routes were established and well maintained. Everyone knew where to get tin, where to sell copper, which ports handled which goods. This efficiency was profitable, but it meant there wasn't much redundancy. When established routes failed, there weren't easy alternatives. Compare this to a less connected world. Imagine you're a farmer in a small isolated community around 1250 BCE. You don't participate in the palace economy. You don't trade internationally. You grow your own food, make your own tools, produce everything you need locally. You're poor compared to people in the connected world. You don't have access to exotic goods or specialized products. But you're also not vulnerable to distant disruptions. If Cyprus stops exporting copper, it doesn't affect you. If Egyptian grain shipments fail, you still have your local crops. Your isolation makes you poor but resilient. This is the paradox of complexity. Connection creates wealth but also creates vulnerability. The more connected you are, the more you can benefit from specialization and trade. But the more connected you are, the more dependent you become on those connections holding. And when they break, you're in trouble. An archaeologist named Joseph Tainter studied this problem in his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. His core argument is that complexity has diminishing returns. Initially, when a society becomes more complex, adding administrative layers, developing specialized roles, building infrastructure, the returns are huge. Agriculture becomes more productive, defense becomes more effective, standard of living increases, but eventually you reach a point where additional complexity costs more than it delivers. Every level of administration needs to be fed, every specialized worker needs support, every bit of infrastructure needs maintenance. In a growing, prosperous society, these costs are manageable because the benefits of complexity outweigh them. But when growth stops, when resources become constrained, maintaining complexity becomes burdensome. You're still feeding all those administrators and supporting all those specialized workers, but you're getting less benefit from them. At that point, societies face a choice. They can simplify, deliberately reducing complexity to match available resources. Or they can try to maintain complexity by extracting more resources from the population. The first option means giving up the benefits of complexity. The second option means overtaxing the productive base, which eventually triggers collapse anyway. Most societies choose the second option. Elites don't want to give up their positions. Institutions resist change, so they squeeze harder, tax more, demand more labor, force more compliance. This works for a while, but it makes the population resentful and reduces their productive capacity. Eventually, the system breaks. The Bronze Age palace economies were complex, very complex. The linear B tablets from Pylos show administrators tracking everything. How much grain each farmer owed, how many rowers each village had to supply, how much bronze each workshop produced. This level of detailed record-keeping required large administrative staffs, scribes who spent years learning to read and write, officials who verified the records, guards who enforced the palace's demands. All of these people needed to be fed and housed and paid. During prosperous times, the system worked. The coordination made possible by this complexity increased overall productivity enough to support the administrative overhead. But during crisis, when drought reduced harvests and trade disruptions cut off imports, maintaining the administrative structure became impossible. There just wasn't enough surplus to feed everyone. And here's where you see the evidence of systems trying to maintain complexity in the face of resource constraints. Those Pylos tablets showing bronze being recalled from temples, that's the palace desperately trying to gather resources. The mobilization of rowers for coastal defense, that's trying to maintain security with whatever resources remain. These are the actions of a system that knows it's in crisis but is trying to maintain its structure, its complexity, in the hope that things will get better. They didn't get better. The palace burned, the administrative system collapsed. And what emerged afterward was much simpler. Village-level organization, no palaces, no scribes, no complex record-keeping. People lived in smaller communities, produced what they needed locally, and had minimal interaction with distant regions. It was poorer, less sophisticated, less culturally rich. But it was sustainable with available resources. This pattern of complexity collapsing to simplicity appears throughout history. The Roman Empire in the West didn't gradually transition to medieval kingdoms. It collapsed, and what emerged was simpler. Fewer cities, less trade, more localized production, simpler political structures. It took centuries to rebuild complexity comparable to what Rome had achieved. The same happened after the 6th century crisis. The Byzantine Empire survived, but it simplified. The elaborate administrative structures of Justinian's era were pared back. The economy became more localized. The sophisticated urban culture of late antiquity gave way to something more rural and fragmented. Now think about this in modern terms. Our world is more complex than any previous civilization, more connected, more specialized, more dependent on global networks, and we've optimized ruthlessly for efficiency. Take the global supply chain. A smartphone contains materials from dozens of countries, rare earth elements from China, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, design in California, assembly in China or Vietnam or India, software from multiple companies across multiple continents. This global coordination is remarkably efficient. It produces sophisticated products at prices that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. But it's also fragile. When COVID-19 disrupted shipping and closed factories, suddenly products weren't available. Computer chips became scarce. Car manufacturers couldn't get the components they needed. It wasn't because the world had less productive capacity. It was because the just-in-time delivery systems that made production efficient had no redundancy. When one link broke, the whole chain seized up. Or look at the financial crisis of 2008. It started with housing market problems in the United States, subprime mortgages, complex financial instruments that bundled those mortgages, banks that held those instruments. When housing prices fell, the mortgages defaulted. The financial instruments lost value. Banks that held them faced losses. So far, that's a problem but not a catastrophe. But the banks were connected. They'd lent money to each other. They'd invested in each other's financial instruments. When one bank faced trouble, other banks exposed to it faced trouble too. The trouble spread through the network. Within months, the crisis had gone global. Banks in Europe that had never made a subprime mortgage were collapsing because they were connected to banks that had. Governments intervened with trillions of dollars to prevent total collapse. It worked, mostly. But it revealed how fragile the system was. The connections that made global finance efficient in good times spread contagion in bad times. This is the Bronze Age collapse in modern dress. Not identical, obviously. We have institutions and tools that Bronze Age kingdoms didn't have. Central banks can inject money into the economy, governments can coordinate responses, we have insurance systems and safety nets, but the fundamental vulnerability is the same. We've built a highly connected, highly efficient, highly complex system. And that system, like all such systems, has a threshold beyond which it can't absorb disruptions. Nobody knows exactly where that threshold is. That's part of the problem. Complex systems often don't show obvious warning signs before they collapse. They appear stable, then suddenly they're not. The transition can be rapid, even catastrophic. There's a concept in systems theory called the complexity resilient rather than just efficient. Some societies are trying. Building strategic reserves of critical materials, diversifying supply chains, investing in renewable energy to reduce dependence on fossil fuel networks, strengthening local food systems while maintaining global ones. These are attempts to add resilience without abandoning the benefits of complexity. But it's a race. Climate change is accelerating. Resource pressures are increasing. Political tensions are rising. The stresses that could trigger cascade failures are building. Whether we can build sufficient resilience before those stresses reach critical thresholds, that's the question we're living through answering. The Bronze Age collapse tells us what happens when we don't. The 6th century crisis shows the same pattern. The 17th century repeats it. The pattern is clear. Complex connected systems create prosperity until they don't. The transition from prosperity to collapse can be rapid. And once collapse starts, it's very hard to stop because each failure triggers more failures. We're not doomed to repeat this pattern, but we're not guaranteed to avoid it either. The choice is ours. Build resilience or accept fragility. Maintain redundancy or optimize for efficiency. Plan for multiple possible futures or assume the present will continue indefinitely. Previous societies didn't have this choice. They couldn't see their vulnerabilities clearly enough to address them proactively. We can. Whether we can muster the collective will and coordination to build resilient complexity rather than just efficient complexity, that's the great question of our age. The Bronze Age collapse, viewed from this perspective, isn't just history. It's a warning. A demonstration of what happens when complex systems face stresses they can't absorb. A reminder that prosperity and sophistication don't guarantee survival. A call to understand our own vulnerabilities while we still have time to address them. But for all we've learned, for all the evidence we've excavated and analysed, there are still enormous gaps in our understanding. Mysteries that remain unsolved. Questions that might never have clear answers, And every few years, new discoveries change the picture in ways we didn't expect. Start with the most basic question. Who were the Sea Peoples? We have the Egyptian name for them. We have those reliefs at Medinet Habu showing them in battle, showing their ships and weapons and distinctive feathered headdresses. We have Rameses III's inscriptions listing the kingdoms they destroyed. But we don't know where they came from or what drove them to move in such numbers. For decades, scholars debated based on limited evidence. Some thought they were Mycenaean Greeks fleeing the collapse of the palace economies. Others suggested Anatolian populations displaced by the Hittite fall. Some proposed they were a coalition of different groups from various regions. The debates were sophisticated but ultimately speculative. We were trying to identify people who left no written records of their own, whose perspective exists only as filtered through Egyptian propaganda. Then genetics entered the picture. In the last decade, techniques for extracting and analysing ancient DNA have improved dramatically. Suddenly we can look at the actual genetic makeup of ancient populations, trace migrations that left no historical record, identify connections that archaeology alone couldn't reveal. Several recent studies have analysed DNA from sites in the ancient Levant that the Philistines, possibly descended from the Peliset branch of the Sea Peoples, settled after the Bronze Age collapse. The genetic evidence shows something fascinating. Around the time of the collapse, there's an influx of European ancestry into these coastal populations. People with genetic markers common in southern Europe, particularly the Aegean and southern Italy, show up in what's now Israel and Palestine. This supports the theory that at least some of the Sea Peoples did come from the Aegean region. But it complicates the picture too. The genetic influx isn't a complete population replacement. The newcomers mixed with existing populations, and the European genetic signature fades over subsequent generations, suggesting the migrants eventually assimilated into local cultures. This doesn't look like conquest and replacement, it looks like migration and integration, but genetic studies also show surprises. Some populations that we thought were connected turn out to be distinct. Others that seem separate show unexpected genetic links. With every new study, the picture becomes more complex, more nuanced. We're just beginning to understand population movements during this period, and each new data set raises as many questions as it answers. Where did these migrants come from exactly? What routes did they travel? Were they fleeing violence in their homelands, or economic collapse, or climate disasters? Did they move as organised groups with leadership and purpose, or as scattered refugees seeking any safe haven? The genetic data can tell us they moved, and roughly when, but it can't tell us why or how. Then there's underwater archaeology. The Mediterranean coast during the Bronze Age was different from today. Sea levels were lower, coastlines extended further. Entire settlement areas that were once above water are now submerged. And we're only beginning to systematically explore these underwater sites. Recent surveys using sonar and remote sensing have identified Bronze Age structures beneath the waves, harbours that served now vanished cities, shipwrecks carrying cargoes that tell us about trade patterns, settlements that were flooded either by rising sea levels or by land subsidence. Each discovery adds to our understanding, but the Mediterranean is vast and most of it remains unexplored. Some of these underwater sites might hold evidence that could transform our understanding of the collapse. Archives preserved in sealed containers, artifacts that show connections we didn't know existed, structural evidence of how cities were destroyed or abandoned. But underwater archaeology is expensive, technically challenging, and slow. It will be decades before we've surveyed even a fraction of the potential sites. The climate evidence keeps improving too. Ice cores from Greenland provide year-by-year records of atmospheric conditions going back millennia. Lake sediment cores from across the Mediterranean region show local climate conditions, vegetation changes, evidence of human activity. Stalagmites from caves in the region preserve climate information in their growth layers. Tree ring data from ancient timbers allows precise dating and shows growing conditions year by year. All of this data is being continuously refined. New cores are being extracted, new analytical techniques are being developed, and the picture that emerges is complex. Yes, there was drought. Yes, temperatures changed. But the timing varies by region. Some areas were hit hard early, others suffered later, some regions recovered while others remained stressed. The climate disruption wasn't uniform. It was patchy, regional, unfolding over decades in ways that affected different areas differently. This complexity makes it harder to draw simple cause and effect conclusions. You can't just say drought caused collapse when the drought wasn't happening everywhere at once. You have to understand local conditions, regional variation, how different societies responded to different levels of climate stress. The work is ongoing, and every new data set adds nuance. New excavations continue to produce surprises. Work at Troy, at Megiddo, at sites across the region, each season brings new finds. Sometimes they confirm existing theories. Sometimes they challenge them. A few years ago, excavations at a site in Israel found evidence of destruction, dating to slightly earlier than scholars had thought. This raised questions about the sequence of events, about whether the collapse happened faster or slower than previous models suggested. Other excavations find evidence of continuity, where we expected disruption. Sites that show some Bronze Age practices continuing well into what should have been the Dark Ages, or evidence of new practices being adopted earlier than we thought. Each discovery requires scholars to adjust their models, refine their theories, acknowledge that the reality was more complex than the simplified narratives suggested. And there are the writing systems we still can't read. Linear A, used by the Minoans, remains largely undeciphered despite decades of effort. We can recognize some signs, make educated guesses about others, but we can't read connected text. If we could, it would reveal Minoan language, culture, religion, economy. Everything the tablets recorded would become accessible, but for now Linear A remains opaque. Cypro-Minoan, used in Cyprus during the Bronze Age, is similarly undeciphered. Tablets exist. We know they're administrative records of some kind, but we can't read them. The language they represent is unknown. Without a bilingual text, something that presents the same content in Cypro-Minoan and a known language, decipherment is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible. These undeciphered scripts represent lost voices, people who lived through the events we're studying, who recorded their experiences, their observations, their understanding of what was happening. If we could read what they wrote, we might have answers to questions we can only speculate about now. But the knowledge is locked away, preserved in symbols we can recognize but not understand. There's also the question of what remains unfound. Archaeological sites are discovered accidentally all the time. A farmer ploughing a field uncovers ancient foundations. Construction workers digging foundations for a new building hit an archaeological layer. Satellite imagery reveals geometric patterns that turn out to be ancient structures. Each accidental discovery reminds us how much is still buried, still unknown. Entire cities from the Bronze Age might be waiting to be found. Not major capitals, those are mostly known, but secondary sites, provincial centres, merchant settlements. Each would add to our understanding. Each might contain archives that would fill gaps in our knowledge. The odds of finding another Pylos or Ugarit, a site with extensive preserved archives, are low, but not zero. It could happen, and if it does, it would change everything we think we know. There's also the debate about whether collapse is even the right framework. Some scholars argue that we're too focused on the dramatic end of the palace economies, that we're missing evidence of continuity and transformation. They point to sites that weren't destroyed, to populations that survived, to practices that continued despite political upheaval. They suggest that what we call collapse was actually transformation, a reshaping of society rather than an ending. This perspective has merit. People did survive. Cultures did continue, even if in altered forms. The Greek language survived the Dark Ages, emerging again when writing returned. Religious practices, mythological traditions, artistic motifs all show continuity beneath the surface disruption. Maybe collapse is too strong a word. Maybe we should talk about transformation, adaptation, restructuring. But then you look at the burned palaces, the abandoned cities, the population crash, the loss of literacy, the economic regression. And collapse seems appropriate. Certainly the people living through it would have experienced it as collapse, as the end of their world. The fact that something emerged afterward, that people adapted and survived, doesn't negate the catastrophe of the transition. Perhaps the truth is that both are correct. It was collapse from one perspective, transformation from another. The palace economies collapsed, but people transformed their societies to survive without palaces. The question is which perspective matters more, and the answer probably depends on what you're trying to understand. Recent work has also revealed more about the aftermath, about how societies rebuilt. The traditional picture of the Greek Dark Ages as a period of poverty and cultural stagnation is being revised. New excavations show more continuity than we thought. Trade didn't completely stop. Metalworking continued. Some artistic traditions persisted. It wasn't the complete civilizational reset that older scholarship suggested. This raises new questions. If the Dark Ages weren't as dark as we thought, what does that mean for our understanding of the collapse? If recovery began sooner than we believed, does that suggest the collapse was less severe? Or does it suggest that human resilience is greater than we give it credit for? That even in the midst of catastrophe, people find ways to maintain connections and preserve knowledge? The work of answering these questions continues. Every excavation season, every new genetic study, every refined climate reconstruction adds data. Sometimes that data supports existing theories, sometimes it challenges them. The scholarly consensus shifts as new evidence emerges. Ideas that seemed certain 20 years ago are now debated. Questions that seemed settled are reopened. And this is how it should be. History isn't static. Our understanding evolves as we develop new tools, find new evidence, ask new questions. The scholars working on the Bronze Age collapse today have access to analytical techniques that didn't exist a generation ago. The scholars working on it a generation from now will have techniques we haven't developed yet. Each generation sees the evidence through different lenses, asks different questions, reaches different conclusions. What we know now is substantial. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was an interconnected world that collapsed over the course of roughly a century, from around 1200 to 1100 BCE. The collapse involved multiple factors including climate disruption, earthquake damage, population movements, warfare, and the fragility of complex interconnected systems. Different regions experienced the collapse differently. Some areas were devastated, others survived with less damage. The aftermath was a period of simplification, reduced trade, population decline, and cultural transformation that lasted centuries before recovery began. But what we don't know is also substantial. We don't fully understand who the Sea Peoples were or what motivated their movements. We don't know the exact sequence of events or how they cascaded from region to region. We don't know why some sites were destroyed while others survived. We can't read key texts that might answer our questions. We haven't found all the relevant archaeological sites. We're still refining our understanding of the climate conditions and how they varied regionally. The mysteries that remain are genuine mysteries, not gaps that will necessarily be filled by more research, though some might be. Some questions might simply be unanswerable with the evidence that survives. The voices that could have told us what happened are silent. The records that would have clarified events are lost or unreadable. We're reconstructing a catastrophe from fragments, and there are pieces missing that will never recover. But that doesn't make the effort futile. Every piece we do recover adds to the picture. Every question we can answer eliminates false theories and points toward truth. Every mystery we solve opens new questions we hadn't thought to ask. The process of understanding the past is ongoing, iterative, never complete, but always advancing. And the questions matter, not just as academic exercises, but as warnings and guides. The Bronze Age collapse shows us that complex societies can fail, that interconnection creates both strength and vulnerability, that climate stress can trigger cascading disruptions, that the things that make civilizations prosperous can also make them fragile. These aren't just historical observations, they're insights relevant to understanding our own world, our own vulnerabilities, our own choices about how to build resilient rather than just efficient systems. So the work continues, in laboratories where geneticists extract DNA from ancient bones, in climate science facilities where researchers analyze ice cores and sediment samples, in underwater surveys mapping submerged Bronze Age coastlines, in excavations across the Mediterranean region where archaeologists carefully uncover evidence of the collapse, in universities where scholars debate interpretations and develop new theories. The Bronze Age collapse is still collapsing in a sense, still revealing its secrets, still challenging our understanding, still raising new questions. The mystery isn't solved, but we're closer to solving it than we've ever been, and every year brings us closer still. But here's what we often forget when we focus on collapse. People survived. Not everyone. Not even most people in many regions. The population crash was real. The suffering was real. The loss was real. But collapse isn't extinction. It's transformation. And what emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age world, while simpler and poorer, was also the foundation for everything that came after. The period following the Bronze Age collapse is traditionally called the Greek Dark Ages, running roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE. Dark Ages suggest complete cultural darkness, a void where civilization used to be. And in some ways, the term is accurate. Writing disappeared from Greece. The Linear B tablets that documented palace administration weren't just no longer produced. The skill of reading them was lost. When Greeks started writing again centuries later, they used a completely different system, the alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians. The knowledge that Linear B had even existed was forgotten until modern archaeologists rediscovered it. The palace economies vanished. The complex administrative structures, the specialized workshops, the international trade networks, all of it ended. Population declined dramatically, possibly by as much as 75% in some regions. Cities shrank or were abandoned entirely. The archaeological record shows smaller settlements, simpler pottery, less evidence of specialized craft production. But dark doesn't mean empty. Dark doesn't mean nobody was there. People lived through the Dark Ages. They farmed. They raised families. They told stories. They maintained communities. Life was harder, poorer, less sophisticated than during the palace period, but it was life, and it contained the seeds of what would eventually become classical Greece. Imagine you're living in Greece around 1050 BCE, 3 or 4 generations after the palace is burned. You've never seen a palace. Your grandparents might have told stories about them, about the great kings and the massive stone walls and the scribes who could make marks on clay that preserved words. But those stories seem like myths, like tales of heroes and gods, not descriptions of a real world that once existed. You live in a small village, maybe 50 or 100 people. Everyone knows everyone. You farm the same land your parents farmed, using bronze tools when you have them, stone tools when you don't. Bronze is valuable now, rare. You can't get tin anymore. The traders who used to bring it, if they ever really existed, don't come anymore. So bronze tools are treasured, repaired, passed down through generations. But there's something new, iron. A few people in your region have figured out how to work it. It's harder to smelt than bronze, requires higher temperatures, different techniques. But iron ore is more common than copper, much more common than tin. You don't need to trade across vast distances to get it. You can find it locally. The iron tools aren't as good as bronze yet. They're more brittle, harder to work, but they're improving. Each generation of blacksmiths learns new techniques, figures out better ways to heat and hammer the metal, and iron has an advantage. When a bronze tool breaks, you might not be able to replace it. When an iron tool breaks, you can make another one from local ore. This is how the Iron Age began, not as a deliberate technological choice, but as necessity. The trade networks that supplied tin for bronze had collapsed. People needed tools. Iron was available, so they learned to work it. Over centuries, they got better at it. Eventually, iron tools became superior to bronze, not just more available, but that took time. The early Iron Age wasn't an improvement over the Bronze Age. It was adaptation to scarcity. Yet even in simplification, things were preserved. The Greek language survived, spoken even though not written. Religious practices continued. The gods that Mycenaeans worshipped, Zeus and Hera, and Poseidon and Athena, they remained. Oral poetry preserved memories of the Bronze Age world, garbled and mythologized but recognizable. The Trojan War, if it happened at all, probably occurred during the late Bronze Age, and the memory of it was preserved through generations of oral poets until Homer, centuries later, composed it into the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those poems, composed in the 8th century BCE but describing events from the 13th or 12th century BCE, contain accurate details mixed with later additions. Mycenaean-era armour described alongside later equipment. Geography that reflects Bronze Age political geography mixed with Dark Age conditions. The poems show oral tradition working, preserving real memories across centuries even without writing. This is resilience. Not the resilience of institutions or political structures, those collapsed, but the resilience of culture, of language, of the human impulse to tell stories and pass them down. The Greeks of the Dark Ages were poorer than their Bronze Age ancestors, but they maintained continuity. They remembered they were Greeks, even as what that meant changed over the centuries, and they weren't alone. While Greece was simplifying, other regions were adapting differently. The Phoenician cities along the Levantine coast, cities like Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, survived the collapse better than most. They were damaged, certainly. Populations declined, trade networks disrupted. But they didn't experience the complete systemic collapse that Greece did. Why? Partly geography. The Phoenician cities were coastal, with economies built around maritime trade and local resources, particularly timber from the Lebanese mountains and purple dye produced from murex shells. When overland trade routes collapsed, they still had the sea. When the palace economies fell and couldn't trade anymore, the Phoenicians found new customers. They adapted, and they did something remarkable. They simplified and democratized writing. The complex syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age, linear B and cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics, required years of training to master. Writing was a specialized skill, controlled by palace and temple bureaucracies. But the Phoenicians, possibly building on earlier experiments in the Sinai, developed an alphabetic system. Instead of hundreds of symbols representing syllables or concepts, the alphabet had about 22 letters representing individual sounds. You could learn it in weeks rather than years. Writing became accessible. Merchants could keep their own records. Any literate person could write down ideas, stories, accounts. This innovation, developed in the shadow of Bronze Age collapse, would eventually spread across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, ultimately the alphabet you're reading or hearing in this moment, they all descend from that Phoenician innovation. The Phoenicians also became the inheritors of Bronze Age maritime knowledge. They knew the sea routes, the harbours, the navigation techniques. When the Mycenaean traders stopped sailing, the Phoenicians expanded into the vacuum. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, they were establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, Carthage in North Africa, settlements in Sicily, Sardinia, Spain. They traded as far as Britain, seeking tin now that the old Bronze Age sources were unavailable. In this way, they preserved and extended Bronze Age trade networks while adapting them to a changed world. The palace economies were gone, but commerce continued. Different players, different organisation, but the fundamental activity of moving goods across the sea, connecting distant regions through trade, that survived. Egypt survived too, though diminished. The New Kingdom ended, giving way to the Third Intermediate Period, an era of division and foreign influence, but Egyptian civilization continued. The temple still functioned, the gods were still worshipped, pharaohs still ruled, though their power was reduced. Egypt didn't fall into a dark age. It simplified, adapted, endured. The pattern across the eastern Mediterranean was similar. Not uniform collapse, but varied responses. Some regions fell harder than others. Some simplified more dramatically, some maintained more continuity. But everywhere, people survived and adapted, and everywhere, even in the simplification, something was preserved. Knowledge, practices, beliefs, stories. The threads of culture remained unbroken even as the fabric was torn and rewoven into simpler patterns. In Anatolia, after the Hittite Empire fell, smaller kingdoms emerged. Neo-Hittite states in southern Anatolia and northern Syria preserved elements of Hittite culture, including the hieroglyphic Luwian script and artistic traditions. They weren't the empire that came before, but they weren't complete breaks either. They represented continuity within transformation. Eventually new powers arose. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, emerging from the northern Mesopotamian heartland, expanded in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE to become the largest empire the world had yet seen. They conquered brutally, but they also preserved and transmitted knowledge. Assyrian libraries contained texts from earlier eras, Babylonian literature and scholarship copied and preserved. When the Assyrians fell in turn, those texts survived to be discovered millennia later. By 800 BCE, Greece was emerging from the Dark Ages. Population was recovering. Trade was resuming, now with the Phoenicians as primary partners. Greek colonists were establishing settlements around the Black Sea, in southern Italy and Sicily along the coasts of Anatolia. The alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians, was spreading. Homer was composing or compiling the great epics. Art was becoming more sophisticated. Cities were growing. The Greece that emerged wasn't a restoration of Mycenaean Greece. It was something new. The political structure was different. City-states rather than palace kingdoms. The economy was different, based on independent farmers and merchant classes rather than palace redistribution systems. The culture was different, though it contained echoes of the Bronze Age past. This new Greece would eventually produce democracy in Athens, philosophy and drama and mathematics and art that still influences the world today. The classical civilization we admire, the foundation of so much of Western culture, was built by people who'd survived the collapse and adapted. Not despite the collapse, but, in some ways, because of it. The palace economies were hierarchical, conservative, resistant to change. Innovation that threatened palace control was discouraged. But in the aftermath of collapse, in the absence of central authority, there was room for experimentation. Different cities tried different political systems. Merchants and craftsmen who'd been subordinate to palace authority became independent. New ideas could spread without palace gatekeepers filtering them. The alphabet itself is evidence of this. Palace scribes would never have developed it. Their power derived from monopolizing the complex scripts. But in a world without palaces, where merchants needed practical writing systems, simplification made sense, and once writing became accessible, ideas could spread faster, be preserved better, accumulate into bodies of knowledge that could be built upon. This is the pattern throughout history. Collapse destroys, but it also liberates. The old systems, with all their hierarchies and rigidities, end. What emerges has the opportunity to be different, to try new approaches, to innovate in ways that weren't possible before, not immediately. The immediate aftermath of collapse is usually chaotic and impoverished, but eventually, after the dust settles and population recovers and new systems stabilize, something new becomes possible. The Roman Empire's fall in the West led eventually to medieval Europe, which developed technologies and institutions Rome never had. Universities, mechanical clocks, printing presses, political philosophies of limited government and individual rights that would have been alien to Roman emperors. None of this was inevitable. None of it was worth the suffering of Rome's collapse. But it happened. The Mongol conquest destroyed cities across Asia in the 13th century. The death toll was enormous, but the Mongol Empire also facilitated exchange between East and West on an unprecedented scale. Technologies and ideas flowed along the Silk Road. Chinese innovations reached Europe. European merchants reached China. The age of exploration that followed, the scientific revolution, the eventual industrial revolution, all built on knowledge and connections that the Mongol period enabled. This isn't to romanticize collapse. Collapse is catastrophic for those experiencing it. People die, knowledge is lost, suffering is real, but humanity survives, and survivors rebuild. Sometimes what they build is poorer than what fell. Sometimes it's different, but eventually richer. The key is that the thread continues. Culture persists. Knowledge accumulates, even if the accumulation is slower during Dark Ages. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed a world, but the people who survived it built another one. Simpler at first, poorer, less sophisticated, but carrying forward what could be preserved, adapting to new realities, innovating where necessary, and eventually, after centuries of recovery, building civilizations that in some ways surpassed what came before. This is the story that gets lost when we focus only on collapse, the story of survival and adaptation and eventual renewal, the story of iron replacing bronze, not immediately but gradually, the story of the alphabet spreading, democratizing writing, enabling new forms of expression, the story of Dark Age Greeks preserving their language and myths until they could write them down again, the story of Phoenicians sailing farther and trading more widely than Bronze Age merchants had, the story of knowledge preserved in Assyrian libraries, in Egyptian temples, in oral traditions passed down through generations. Collapse isn't the end, it's transformation. Painful, destructive, often tragic transformation. But transformation nonetheless. The world that existed before can't be recovered, but a different world can be built from the pieces that remain. And that world, given time, can achieve things the previous world never imagined. This is what resilience actually looks like. Not institutions that never fail, not systems that never collapse, but people who survive failure and rebuild afterward. Cultures that adapt to changed circumstances. Knowledge that persists even when the institutions that created it are gone. The long, patient work of recovery, of taking what remains and building something new, something that honours the past while adapting to the present. The Bronze Age world fell, but the people who survived it, who lived through the Dark Ages, who simplified and adapted and preserved what they could, they were the ancestors of everything that came after. Classical Greece, the Roman Empire, the civilizations that followed, All of it built on foundations laid during the recovery from collapse. And that's the final lesson. Not that collapse can't happen. It can, and has, and will again. But that collapse isn't ending. It's transition. Terrible transition. Costly transition. But transition nonetheless. What comes after depends on what we preserve, how we adapt, what we choose to build from the pieces that remain. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed a world, but it didn't destroy the human capacity to create new worlds. That survived. That always survives. That's the deepest resilience of all. So here we are, 3,200 years after the Bronze Age world fell apart. Looking back across the centuries at people who faced something we can barely imagine, an entire interconnected world collapsing within a single human lifetime. Everything they knew, everything that seemed permanent and stable simply ending. And yet, we're here. You're here listening to this because those people survived. Not all of them. Not even most of them in some regions. But enough. Enough to preserve language and culture and stories. Enough to rebuild slowly, patiently across generations. Enough to create the world that came after, which eventually became the world we inhabit now. The pattern is still there. The same vulnerabilities that brought down Bronze Age kingdoms exist in our modern systems. We're connected globally, dependent on networks, optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Climate is changing. Resources are stressed. The potential for cascading failures exists. We'd be foolish to pretend otherwise. But we're also the inheritors of every lesson those collapses taught. We can see the pattern. We can understand the fragilities. We can choose, if we have the wisdom and will, to build differently. To value resilience alongside efficiency. To maintain the redundancy that survival requires. To remember that complexity is a gift, but also a responsibility. And if we fail, if our systems collapse, the way Bronze Age systems did, the way 6th century systems did, the way 17th century systems did, then we'll do what humans have always done. We'll survive. We'll adapt. We'll preserve what we can. We'll rebuild. It won't be easy. It won't be without suffering, but the thread will continue. It always has. That's the comfort, if there is one, in studying these ancient catastrophes. They remind us that we're part of something larger than any single civilization. Part of a human story that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, through ice ages and migrations and extinctions and survivals. We are the descendants of people who faced the unimaginable and somehow made it through. So sleep well. Dream of those ancient cities, if you like. The palaces and the trade ships and the scribes pressing marks into clay. Dream of the survivors too, the ones who lived through the collapse and kept going. They're your ancestors, in a sense. We all descend from people who refused to give up, even when their world was ending. Civilizations rise and fall. That's the pattern. But humanity endures. That's the truth beneath the pattern. And tomorrow when you wake, you'll be part of that continuity. Another day, another generation, another link in the long chain that connects us to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. Rest now. The mysteries will still be there in the morning. History is patient. And so, for now, are you.